And because I know that you're so good at estimating because we've done it so many times, you'll remember that estimating means you're finding not an exact answer, but you're finding an estimate and about some, right, something easy to divide. So we're changing the numbers around so that you can then divide in your head and make it a little bit easier.
And there's normally a 0 at the end. That's just
Yes, good one. There usually is. Okay, so the essential question for this chapter is, what strategies can I use to divide by a 2-digit divisor? So as I told you before, we got started, the difference between this chapter and the one before was that we have a 2-digit divisor. So that just means that the numbers we're dealing with are going to be a little bit bigger. So because the numbers are a little bit bigger, the strategies are going to be a little bit different that we use to divide. So like in chapter 3, we were able to draw pictures or use models, things like that. And on this one, we aren't going to really be doing that as much because we're using bigger numbers. So the strategy wouldn't really be kind of a waste of time to do some of those strategies with bigger numbers because it just doesn't work as easily. So just like I told you before we started chapter 3, not every strategy that you learn with division is one that you're going to enjoy using, and it's not one that you might not use it with every single question. It just depends on the type of question that you get. So today we're going to learn one of those strategies, which is estimating. So here's a pattern question for your whiteboard. Remember, if you don't have a whiteboard marker, you can always just use your notebook small and just use your notes to figure this question out. So here it is. It says, if this pattern continues, everybody see the pattern? What will be the letter in the 35th position? So which letter would be in the 35th place if that is the pattern? So starting from the beginning, right over here, what letter would be in the 35th position if that pattern continued just the same? So try to figure that out. Okay, so we got that A was that letter. Let's go to your notes. The question says, what generalizations can you make when rounding dividends and divisors? So in your notes, I need you to write chapter 4, lesson 1. We're going to start there. And the title of the lesson is Estimate Quotients. So you need to have this in your notes. Then we're going to answer that question. This goes in your notebook. So we talked about this before. If you were to look back into your notes, the first word says estimate. The title of the lesson is Estimate Quotients. Here's what I was saying. If you look back in your notes, back in the beginning of chapter 3, we did a lesson called Estimate Quotients. We've done that lesson before. The difference was that lesson was a 1-digit divisor, and this lesson is about 2-digit divisors. What we're doing has not changed, though. We're still rounding or using compatible numbers, so we're going to write that in our notes. So fact families is what we talked about when we talked about compatible numbers. And I'm not writing a definition in here because we've already learned about it and it's already in your notes in a different chapter. So sometimes you can round the numbers, so you're going to round up or down. Sometimes you can use compatible numbers, meaning we're using numbers that we can divide easily in our heads, which, as Nolan told us earlier, note to self, they're numbers that end in 0 because those are numbers that we can easily remember. You're just looking at the basic fact piece of it, and then you're going to worry about the zeros later. And so we've done a lesson it's very, very similar. So once we start doing some examples, I think you're going to remember how we've already done this. Just bigger numbers.
Is that compatible?
This word is compatible, rounding and or compatible numbers or fact families. So here's your first example. 512 divided by 52. So basically, we've done this before. We're finding an estimate of this number or of this question. And we're going to take the first digit of one of the numbers of the divisor, which would be this number, and we're going to take the first couple of digits of the dividend, and we're going to see how we can make those into fact families. So I have a 5 and I have a 51. So if I made this 52 right here, if I made this into 50, so that now I'm just looking at a 5, and I made this number here 500 or 50. Now I can easily do that dividing in my head. So I know that 5 goes into 50 10 times, right? And then because this number has a 0 in it and this number has a 0 in it, I can cross them out. And then the answer is 10, about 10. Because remember, it's an estimate. So I'm looking at the first digit or the first couple of digits in the number, trying to find a compatible fact family, something that can work together so that I can easily do that division in my head. Works pretty much the same way as it worked before, except before this number might have only been 5. Like this would have just been a 5, or maybe it would have been a 6 or something like that. Then you would have had to keep it a 5 and then divide that in, make that 500, right? So we've done something like this before. The difference is now that number, instead of just being 5, is now 52. So instead of changing it into, you're going to have to change it into 50, because you want to have numbers that have zeros at the ends, because then you can do the crossing out of the zeros, which is that really cool trick. So this is one of our strategies for the week. Let's try another example. What if I have 237 divided by 83? And remember, I'm estimating. So if I look at the first couple, you should do this too whenever you're working on these problems. Don't we love when that happens? Hold on. There we go. Let's rewrite that. Really?
Why that was happening?
I don't know. If I there's a little button on the side of my pen, so if it gets pushed, that's what usually does it. Let's try again. 237 divided by 83. So this is something that you should do also. Underline the first digit of this number and the first 2 digits of that number. That's usually what you end up looking for fact families with. That's why I'm going to underline it, because then I'm kind of ignoring the rest of those numbers, because I'm going to probably end up turning them into zeros. I'm just going to look and see what those first digits. So between 8 and 23, what is something I can do to make that into a fact family? What's something I can change to make that something that's easy to divide in my head? So the 23, make it a 24? Because 8 and 24 are part of a fact family, right? 8, 3, and 24 are a fact family. So if I change this 23 and make it a 24, which I'm really making that 237 into a 240, then I divide. Yeah. Why does it keep doing that today? Usually it's once and then it stops. Let's try again. 240, and then I divide by 80. Because remember, I said anything that I'm not underlining there, I'm pretty much going to make into zeros. So then, no. Now I divide 8 into 240, which is 3. 8 goes into 243 times. And these zeros, anybody know why I crossed out the zeros? That was a trick we learned already, right?
Because if the both numbers have the same amount of zeros, then you cross them both out. But if one of the numbers have more, then you only cross out one of the zeros, and that number crosses to the 0.
So the only way you can cross out the zeros is if one on each side. So if one had a 0 and the other one was already used for something else, I couldn't cross it out. Like if this was just an 8 instead of an 80, I could not cross that 0 out, and that 0 would become a part of my answer. Then it would be a 30. But in this case, my answer is about 3. Let's try another example. Hopefully my pen doesn't start doing weird things again. Yes, try this one by yourself. if you can figure this one out. Pay attention. You didn't get the whole last example. You missed a whole example. Nolan, what did you change?
I did 360 and 60.
So actually, when I did my underlining, because remember, this is what I told you to do, underline the first two digits and just the first digit, and then look, and like he said, you don't actually have to change that much because 6 and 36 are actually a basic fact already, right? They're part of a fact family. So if I make that 360, and I make this one just 60, because I want them to end in zeros, because I'm estimating, we want to make it easy for us to do in our head. So the 6 goes into 36 6 times. These can be crossed out, and then my answer is just 6.
Wouldn't the actual answer be 7? I don't know.
It would probably be close to that. It's gonna, because I've actually made them a little bit smaller. I've made the numbers a little bit smaller, which means my estimate is gonna be a little bit smaller than the actual answer. That probably doesn't go in exactly. You're gonna get like a decimal answer or a fraction answer.
Because I thought 1 goes into 2 and 6 goes into 36. That's what I thought.
Oh, you could try it and see if you really wanted to know.
Okay. Yeah, I got 6.
Just an estimate, so.
Because you can just do times.
Okay, here's another one for your notes. Now, there's a whole lot of writing on this slide. Because there's a couple of different ways. Remember, there's one way that is estimate by rounding, which we could do. Then we could do compatible numbers. What we've really been doing more are the compatible numbers, because making it into a fact family makes it really easy for you to solve the problem in your head, because you already know all your fact families. It makes it easy. So because we knew that 6 and 36 went together because of a fact family, it made it really easy to solve it, and you didn't have to do any math on paper. You did it all in your head. So here's your question that I want you to do in your notes. 564 divided by 64, and see what you're going to change it to. And like I said, there is 2 different ways, but the way we've been practicing the most are the compatible numbers, so that's probably the way you're going to want to use. What do you guys think you would do? There's a couple of ways to do this one, because we're estimating, remember, so there's always more than one. There's usually, I won't say always, there's usually more than one right answer. And most of the time, both of those answers would be okay, especially if you can tell me why you got that answer. Usually it's going to be okay. So what's one way you could do this one? Like, what's something that you could change those numbers to make this one compatible numbers you could do in your head? Malachi, what would you do?
I made 564 into 560.
560, and you divided it by what?
60.
60. So 6 goes into 56. 6 times 9, check again. 54. 7 goes into 56. And 6 goes into 54. So here's one thing you could do. If you wanted to make that 560, you can make that a 70, because you could change the 6 into a 7, and you can make it 560 and 70. I think that's the fact you were thinking of. So if I did 7 into 56, it goes 8 times, right? And then you could cross out this 0 and cross out this 0 so that you could get 8.
Yeah, but you can't round the what is it called, I think it was a 60, right?
The divisor?
Yeah.
You could change either of those numbers.
Oh,
Doesn't always have to be the dividend. It's whichever one you think of.
you can make 56.
So what's another way? What if I wanted to leave that as 60? Then what would this number over here have to be? Aiden.
It'll have to be 54, 540.
540, so that your fact is 54. Because 6 goes into 54 9 times, and then you could cross these out. So 8 or 9 would be an appropriate answer for that one. Do you guys see how we got that? So on one of the questions, we changed the divisor, and on the other one, we changed the dividend, and we got an answer that was pretty close. So if you actually did this division, you're probably going to get an answer somewhere between 8 and 9. Like it's not going to go in evenly. You're going to have a remainder, or you're going to have a decimal answer or something like that. So it's going to be a number between 8 and 9. Okay? All right. Look at your first page. Example number 1. We're going to go over example number 1 real quick. Here it is. It says, the school principal has, listen carefully. All you gotta do is look over at your math paper. You already pulled it out. I gave you some time to do that.
Really?
Yeah. Sean, you ready? The school principal has 812 flyers to pass out equally to 19 different teachers. About how many flyers would each teacher receive? So your clue here, because remember we're taking our proficiency next week, and they don't tell you, find an estimate or find an exact answer. You have to figure it out based on the question. So this word right here that says about, I'm going to stand over here so that all you guys, make sure you guys are listening and not talking to each other. So the word about lets you know that you are finding an estimate. So when you read question number 1, when you're looking at your math proficiency next week and you see a word problem and it says the word about, you know that that means it's an estimate. And you don't have to ask me. You know that you're going to look for an estimate. So I'm going to see which of these numbers I can change so that it will go in evenly. So I could round, this one has you rounding the divisor to the nearest 10, and then rounding the dividend to the nearest 100, and then doing your division. I'm going to skip to the next slide because we've been really using compatible numbers more than rounding. Rounding is a way that you could do it, but I don't want to confuse people and show you both ways. I think the compatible, oh, it's not on the next slide.
I mean, wouldn't it be 8?
Let's just write it on the side. 812 divided by 19.
You would do the 20 to 20. I mean, the 19 to 20.
You would make the 19 a 20?
And then,
Do you guys agree with him? He says make the 19 a 20.
And then the 812, you would make it into 810.
So I think you were partially right on that. Do you see where I underlined the first 2 digits in that first number and the first digit in the second one? Dividing 1 into something really isn't going to do anything, right?
Yeah, and the
If I
answer
leave
would be
1,
fine.
so that's why he said make that a 20, because if I leave it as a 1 and I divide 1 into 81, I'm just going to get 81, right?
I mean,
So,
it's easier if you turn it
um,
into 810, you can get 5 as your answer.
If I make that
You won't get
810, because 2 doesn't go into 81 though. What if I make it just an 800,
Yay, that's right.
right?
Easier.
No.
And then the answer would be 400.
But then,
Because then you can put,
6, 8. So
See,
the
watch.
answer would be 40.
right, so you have a 4 because 2 goes into 8 4 times. And then I'm going to cross out that 0. But because there's 1 0 after the 20, I can only cross out 1 0 after the 800, which leaves me this extra 0 that needs to go down here, which is why they said 40. Everybody see what I was doing? I'm going to erase that and do it again just so you could see it. So I have 812 divided by 19. If I change the 19 into a 20, because I'm looking at this first digit, and I make this 81 into an 800, now I can do my dividing. And I could only cross off 1 0 because each number only had 1 0.
Wait, so then how do you do it on here? Would it be 20, 20, 20,
Yes, like that.
800, 10, and then 800?
That's why the lines make it confusing. So I think this is how, if you want to write in it, if you want to write into the lines, just write it like this.
I say you just write the same.
It's just hard sometimes the way they do the lines, because the line
What
sometimes
about for one
makes
of our
it hard.
problems we have that? Can we just put like the answer?
Okay, so listen up. Listen up over there. Anthony asked, do we have to use the lines, or do we have to fill in the lines? Can we just write it? Most of the problems don't have a lines. Only these first 2 examples have the lines, and then after that there's just questions there, and you just answer them how you see fit. So you don't have to worry about the lines most of the time. So this time each teacher would get about 40 flyers, and you could always check your work by multiplying. So if I multiply 40 times 20, 4 times 2 is 8, add these 2 zeros on, that equals 800, which is pretty close to 812. So then I know that I probably did that right. Because if you put 4 there, would 4 make sense? Because I could see some people putting 4 as their answer. Do you see how could somebody put 4 as their answer?
No,
What would you do? Hold on, let him answer. What would you do if somebody put 4 as their answer, what would they have done incorrectly to get that?
they would have 80 instead of 800.
So if they wrote 80 instead of 800, what's another way?
They didn't put the 0 on.
If they didn't add that other 0 on. So this 0 right here,
They missed the 0.
yeah, if that 0 right there that was meant to go on the end of the answer, if they accidentally crossed it out, so they crossed out too many zeros, or they just forgot to put it on and got 4 as their answer, that wouldn't really make sense, right? Because if there's almost 20 teachers and there's 800 flyers, if every teacher only got 4, that wouldn't make sense, would it? So that's part of where at the end of the question you have to really think about it, like, does that answer, is that a reasonable answer? Does it make sense? If you don't think it does, you should go back and check your work again. All right, let's look at example number 2. This is the one I think that's going to give you the 2 different ways. Let me see. So we're going to estimate 234 divided by 41. This is the way that's asking you to round, and it's kind of confusing with all the lines and things. And rounding is not as easy, I don't think, as finding a compatible number, because your basic facts are your basic facts, and you've known those forever. So it's usually easier to do it that way. So I'm just writing it on the side. I'm going to underline the first 2 digits of that number, the first digit of the second number. What do you think you would make these, what would I make this problem to find an accurate estimate? Anybody know? How about the girls at the back table over there? Anybody know? What would I make these numbers to make it an accurate estimate? Ashley, what do you think?
40, you'd make 41, 40, and then you would make 234, 240.
So if I were looking at these first digits here, the 4 would go into 24 6 times, and then I would cross these out, right, and just get 6 as my answer, right? And again, using your making sure that your answer seems reasonable, using some common sense at the end, you could say 6 times 40 would be about 204. You know it's going to be over a couple hundred at least. So that kind of gives you an extra little hint. Okay, let's do, I didn't fill in all the lines. If you want to try to fill in all the lines, you can. We just use compatible numbers again. Remember how I told you they're all tools in your tool belt, and you don't have to necessarily solve it one way. You can choose which way works best for you. So, like on this question, where it says to estimate this and show how you estimated, then it has all these lines. If you would like to just write it on the side, you're still going to be showing me how you estimated. So I want you to try this one for a second, then we're going to see what you got. So this is your guided practice question. 31 into 30. Okay, so change 31 into 30, because I'm looking at these first digits here. And then what would I change 312 to?
And you would change 312 to 300.
To 300. That's right. So if I change this to 300, then I can divide 3 into 3, and it goes once. 1 0 here and 1 0 here means I can cross those out. And then you have 1 extra 0 that becomes part of your answer, right? So did you get 10 as your answer?
Yeah.
Good. You could also divide, watch, you could have also done 3 into 30, and that equals 10, and then just crossed out those zeros. You could do it that way too. Depends on which way you see it. Kind of depends on how you look at it. Okay, so for the next, I'm going to give you 15 minutes today. So for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to let you work on that, the rest of your assignment. Just got to keep your voices down. If you need help, you can ask a neighbor or me.